p.m. on C-SPAN 2. Well, now on C-SPAN, we want to take you to a debate that happened today on immigration. It's between the writers and editors of the American Conservative, The Nation, and the Washington Examiner. Judy Woodruff of PBS moderated.
So hello, everyone. I'm Judy Woodruff with the PBS NewsHour, and I'm so pleased to be here to participate in this podious event at George Washington University. I think we have a real treat in store of an invigorating and thoughtful discussion of a subject that we know is so important to all of us and to our country. The resolution the two sides are going to be debating is America needs more immigrants. And we have an excellent quartet, if you will, to do the debating. I'm going to introduce them now, starting with the two who are representing the nation. They are Sasha Abramsky, who is seated right here. He is a frequent contributor to the nation. He's the author of several books, including Inside Obama's Brain and The American Way of Poverty, How the Other Half Still Lives. His most recent book, Jumping at Shadows, The Triumph of Fear and the End of the American Dream, looks at the role irrational fear plays in divisive issues like gun control, health care, and immigration. Next to Sasha is Michelle Chen. She is a contributing writer for The Nation, a contributing editor at Dissent magazine, and a contributing writer at In These Times. She's also a co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum on Pacifica's WBAI and Dissent's Belabored podcast. She studies history at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Representing the opposition from the American Conservative on my left, on your right, please welcome, and I want to get this in correct order, Jim Antle. Jim is editor of the American Conservative. Previously, he was politics editor for the Washington Examiner. He was managing editor of the Daily Caller, and he was associate editor of the American Spectator. Antle is the author of Devouring Freedom, Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? And seated next to him, as part of the American Conservative team, is Helen Andrews. Helen is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in First Things, in Spectator USA, the Claremont Review, and American Affairs, among many others. Helen Andrews was a 2017 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. So we welcome all four of them. As I say, it's going to be a lively discussion. Just a few words before we begin. We want to get a sense of what you in the audience and any of you who are following beyond this room think about the subject of immigration, about whether America needs more immigrants. So we're going to ask you to cast a vote, and you have two ways to do that. One is to text, take out, normally people tell you to put away your smartphone. We're asking you to take it out. And to text the numbers 22333, I think this is behind me. And once you do, if you believe in the position that America needs more immigrants, then type in nation. If you think America does not, if you disagree that America needs more immigrants, then type in AMCON for American Conservative, AMCON. So that's one way you can vote. The second way you can vote, if you don't want to text, is simply go to the website, and I'm going to spell this out, pollev, POLLEV.com/Podius Debate, PODIUS debate. And once you get to that website, you can vote for or against the resolution. So that will give us a sense of where people are coming from on this question as we begin tonight's discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to say go. We're going to start with opening statements. Those are going to last 25 minutes approximately. We're going to divide them as evenly as we can. between the two sides, starting with the nation, and that's going to be 12 minutes on each side, but that means it's divided, so 6, 6, 6, and 6. So have at it. Sasha, it's all yours.
You want me over there?
Actually, to that microphone, yeah. And the clock will tell you where we are.
Well, first of all, thank you, George Washington University, for hosting this. And thank you, Judy, for moderating it. And thank you, most of all, for coming out here tonight to invest some of your time and your intellectual energy in this really vital question about whether America needs more immigrants. Now, statements like that never occur in a vacuum. There is always a context to a policy question around immigration or any other issue of the day. And the context that this question is occurring in is Trump's United States of America. Now, from the get-go, from the time that Trump declared his candidacy in 2015, came down the elevator at Trump Tower and declared that Mexicans were rapists and criminals, from the get-go, the Trump era has been defined by a xenophobia, by a hatred and a suspicion of people who are different, who look different, who speak differently, who come from different places. In the 2016 campaign, Trump's immigration policy was shaped by the ethno-nationalism of Steve Bannon. In the years since Trump was elected president, his immigration policy has been shaped and the bureaucracies changed by the ideas of people like Stephen Miller. And Trump's modus operandi is essentially to say that we want fewer immigrants, especially fewer immigrants who look a certain way, who worship a certain way, who come from certain countries. Trump's idea is that we need fewer immigrants from a Muslim background. In fact, so adamant is he on that during the campaign he said he would admit no Muslims to America, and after the election he tried to and partially succeeded in implementing a travel ban. He has decided we need fewer immigrants from what he terms, and pardon the French, shithole countries, people who come from poor countries with dysfunctional governments. He has decided we need fewer immigrants getting visas as a result of the diversity lottery, which predominantly allows immigrants in from countries in Africa. He has decided that those roughly 1 million people who to all intents and purposes are Americans and who were given DACA status under the Obama administration, he has decided their status should be cast into doubt. The Trump administration has decided that if you are an immigrant with temporary protected status, you come from a country like Honduras or El Salvador, your status will be revoked. And if you are one of the 500,000 US citizen children of those immigrants, you face the prospect of being de facto orphaned by Trump's immigration policy. By contrast, Trump has announced that he wants more immigrants from some other countries. And in particular, he has decided he wanted, in his public statements, more immigrants from Norway. Here's the problem. Norway has one of the highest standards of living on Earth. Norway has one of the most generous social benefits programs on Earth. Norway has some of the most progressive environmental policies on Earth, and year in, year out, Norway finishes either at the top or near the top of global happiness indexes. Now, that's not the way immigration flows work. It's not the way they work today. It's not the way they worked yesterday. And it's not the way they're going to work tomorrow. You cannot pick and choose who you allow into a country and say we will only allow in the most affluent and the most educated, because quite honestly, if you were an affluent, educated Norwegian looking at Trump's America in 2018, you would have precious little incentive to up and end it and come over here. So here's the problem. If we go down that road of fewer immigrants, if we accept it's a pipe dream, we're not going to get more Norwegian immigrants, but it's certainly not a pipe dream that we can curtail the flow of other immigrants, if we embrace Trump's anti-immigration policies, here's what we face. We face fewer workers coming into this country willing to do the jobs that for various reasons homegrown Americans have long shunned. We face fewer international students coming in with all of the cultural and intellectual benefits that that brings. We face fewer entrepreneurs willing to dream their dreams here in the United States. And we face fewer cutting-edge scientists coming into this country, as seen by the recent hand-wringing over the lack of quantum computer experts being admitted into the United States. We need more immigrants for two reasons. One of them is the cultural and the economic dynamism that immigration has always brought to this land of immigrants. And the second is the moral imperative. If we turn our back on refugees, if we turn our back on asylum seekers, if we turn our back on the poor, the vulnerable, the dispossessed, and the persecuted, we are throwing away America's unique role on the global stage. For all of those reasons, I urge you today to back our motion that America is a better place when we have more immigrants. Thank you.
The American Conservative, you have 6 minutes now. Jim Mann.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank my panelists on both sides of the issue. I want to thank Judy for moderating. I want to thank George Washington University. I want to start by framing what exactly we're saying no to, because the phrase, do we need or want more immigrants, could mean a variety of things. I would envision that, yes, we will have more immigrants come to the United States. What I object to is increasing immigration levels above their current levels of more than 1 million admitted per year. And I think that a lot of that, my reasons for objecting to that in this climate, have to do with where we are as a country right now. I think at the moment we are admitting immigrants really on a self-selected basis. All of the undocumented immigration is self-selected. And a good bit of our legal immigration is based on who you're related to, and a relatively small percentage of it is based on what kind of skills or what your prospects for economic success are in the United States. Now, there have been times in our history where that would have been less problematic than it is today. But we are living in an economy where there is less upward mobility than we have seen in the past, where there is a great deal of competition for low-skilled labor. It is very difficult for the economic prospects of people who don't have a high school diploma, for people with some college. They're seeing wages decline. They're seeing jobs disappear. And quite frankly, we're admitting people to do jobs that, because of the pace of technological innovation, may not even exist within our lifetimes. And we are seeing a lot of political upheaval over that. And we've seen, obviously, a lot of the focus has been on Donald Trump, but it's Hillary Clinton who recently noted that the migration issue in Europe has inflamed what she described as right-wing populism, and currently it has introduced some of that into our own political climate here in the United States. So I would argue that you should side with our motion if you don't like the current political climate of the United States under President Trump. President Trump would not have been possible if we were not mismanaging our immigration policy. We currently, I think, have a country that is very divided, where people are very angry, where people have to read magazine articles to teach them how to talk to their own family members during Thanksgiving. Perhaps some of those articles were helpful to you this year. Now, a lot of that is quite separate from immigration. Immigration is not the leading cause of our income inequality. Immigration is not the leading cause of our political divide. It's not the leading cause of our cultural divides. But it is something that is a legitimate government function to control, and it is something that we can quite easily regulate, albeit not without costs. And I think that there would be benefits towards moving our immigration flow to being more skilled, somewhat less family-based, and to be somewhat more modest numbers, but would still be in raw numbers much larger than the immigration flows of most of the rest of the world. Welcoming people is a huge part of the American experience. It's a huge part of the American tradition, but it's only one part. The welcoming also has to come in a context of us all coming together. There's nothing to welcome someone to if we don't, in the end, have a commonality around which we unite. And the United States has had greater success at doing that with people from all over the world than any other country that has ever existed. I think in our current climate, keeping immigration flows at their current levels or somewhat lower would be the best policy for us coming together, immigrant, native, and Americans who come from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of races, and a variety of income levels. And so that's why I think, yes, we need more immigrants, but we don't need more immigration levels beyond our current admission levels annually. Thank you.
All right. All right, back to the nation.
Actually, this microphone is kind of fake, so I'm just going to leave that there.
I think we're using your lapel mic, so you can go ahead, even without the stand.
Yeah, now.
It's a good omen.
Yeah, now the jig is up. Sorry, guys. But anyway, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for hosting us. So like my fellow teammate, and it seems also my opponents, I too struggled with this open-ended debate question. First of all, it strikes me as a little bit counterproductive. Second of all, it strikes me as a little bit redundant and also kind of racist. So I would say it's actually a question of what exactly are we counting and why? Because to me, migration has never been about numbers. We do tend to think of migration in finite terms, in terms of rule of law, in terms of national boundaries, in terms of policing checkpoints, visas, beginnings and endings of journeys. Yet contrary to popular stereotype, I think we ought to think of human movement as a continual process. It's a world historical phenomenon with neither a beginning nor an end. But on a more practical level, it has always constituted our national corpus and our body politic. It is who we are. It is part of our national identity. And to shun migration, to try to regulate it, is always a problematic, if not impossible prospect. So whether you are native born, or a member of one of the indigenous peoples of this continent, or just crossed the border yesterday, we should be debating immigration as not something that is a threat, nor is it universally a good thing. But debating immigration is basically debating part of our existence. It is integral to our national existence as a nation, and it is part of who we all are as individuals. And it's also unavoidable. So the question more immigrants or fewer, to me, it's kind of moot, because it's not up to us to regulate this anyway. It's not a bean counting exercise. It's not taxation. It's not fiscal policy. It is simply part of the human condition. Our ability, our will, and our right to move across borders is as integral to humanity as is our sense of morality, our ideas of justice, and the love we feel for our friends and our family members. We should not only have more migration insofar as we want to live in a society that is increasingly human and more embracing of the human condition, but we must have more migration because it is part of an inevitable process that has been going on since time immemorial. In fact, it predates the whole concept of nation states, I would argue. Migration just is. Globalization just is. People move, and they always have. So one might argue that, well, national sovereignty is also an existential issue, right? And it is something that is in crisis right now. And that is part of the right-wing rhetoric that is currently taking over much of Europe and probably this country as well. The argument that we need less migration, though, is a curious one. Because, of course, any group of newcomers is going to have human needs because they are human, not because they are newcomers. They need food, shelter, health, and they want jobs, right? Even the people coming across the border right now, whom Trump deems as criminals and a threat and an invasion of this country, all they are asking for is, one, sanctuary, they want refuge, and second, they want jobs, right? So the idea of wanting to limit these newcomers in the name of protecting ourselves from some vague threat. I mean, it might be justifiable from a perspective of individual scarcity. So I agree that some people in this country may feel that they are in serious crisis and therefore they have nothing to share. But as a matter of governance, right? Governments do, under our current laws, it is true, have nearly unilateral power to control borders, right? That is fundamental to the concept of national sovereignty. But because there are so few safeguards for these laws that govern our immigration regime, more often than not, the borders themselves lead to a maldistribution of resources that is antithetical to human welfare. And that is antithetical to human welfare on both sides of the border, right? For people living in this country as well as for people living outside of it who want to get in. The result for us policy-wise is distorted analysis of what borders are intended to do, because migration should be dealt with as an inevitable, unavoidable product of globalization, which is as essential to us as water, air, as democratic governance, and as humanitarianism as a concept. So on the flip side, what is the price of enforcement, right? To abuse, to imprison, to exclude people simply because they crossed a border under the wrong circumstances, that cannot be morally justified. Even dyed-in-the-wool conservatives, they reject the notion of identity politics, right? They argue that people should be justified on their individual merits, on the content of their character. How then can any free society try to police people simply on the basis of the fact that they were born on the wrong side of an arbitrarily drawn line between nation states? Especially when they're legitimately seeking asylum, that is, sanctuary from persecution. To do so is to fundamentally deny not only the rights, but the facts of human nature. As I said before, we are all from somewhere else, and we artificially divide nations, but at what cost? Who's to say which human being does not belong on one side of the wall versus another? But beyond the numbers, there's a basic argument for justice here. To deny people the right to move in order to better their circumstances, I would argue, is as cruel and as unjust as denying someone the right to breathe and eat because you deem them to have taken up more than they need for food and air, right? To deny them freedom and basic decent living conditions for the sake of depriving them is logical only if your goal is to eliminate a certain population of people in this country. But what is the social cost?
Time's up.
And that is why I urge you to vote in favor of our proposition.
Okay. Thank you. Ellen.
That's what they said last time. That's the argument I always hear from proponents of higher immigration. They say restrictionists tell us that immigrants are lowering our wages and not assimilating to our culture. But that's what they said about the Irish and the Italians, and that worked out fine. So it must just be nativist paranoia. But the fact that an argument was made 100 years ago doesn't prove that it's wrong. Quite the opposite, it may mean that there's something to it. The 19th century Boston Brahmins said that the Irish were vastly overrepresented in their city's prisons and on its relief rolls, and they were correct. But we can set those kinds of negative effects to the side because they were temporary. You know, a third of immigrants who arrived in the second half of the 19th century were illiterate in any language. But their children learned to read and write, and their grandchildren went to college. What didn't change was that those immigrants and their descendants remained a solid voting bloc for the Democratic Party. The biggest consequence of the Ellis Island Great Wave of immigration was to shift American politics permanently and drastically to the left. It started from the moment they arrived. Every city in America in the 19th century that had a large immigrant population immediately developed its own Tammany Hall with its corrupt urban bosses. And that was completely revolutionary. The idea that you could simply bribe somebody into voting for you, not by passing policies favorable to their interests, but by literally just giving them stuff, was unprecedented in the American political tradition. It was thought to be a corruption of democracy, which is supposed to be about deliberation among citizens, not the distribution of largesse from patron to client. One politician who took careful note of this first American welfare state during his political apprenticeship in the New York State legislature was Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, when he became president, he took Tammany Hall methods national. Now let's be clear about one fact of history. FDR would not have been nominated or elected without the votes of the urban ethnics. They were a crucial part of the New Deal coalition. Catholics voted for FDR at rates of up to 80%. And the consequence was the transformation of the American state into something that the framers of the Constitution would not have recognized, but which Boss Tweed would have found very familiar. Then the immigrant vote moved us another standard deviation to the left 30 years later with the Great Society, because JFK would not have been elected without the votes of those same Catholic ethnics, including some deceased ones in Cook County. It took 100 years for the Democratic lock on the votes of those immigrants and their descendants to be broken with the rise of the Reagan Democrats. But after 100 years, it was already too late. The transformation of our government had been effected. So when you ask yourself whether we need another great wave of immigrants now, one of the things to consider is whether or not you think we need another huge and permanent transformation in our state into something more leftist. Because today's immigrants are just as solid for the Democrats as the Irish and the Italians were. Not just Hispanics, but Asian Americans vote for Democrats at rates of 2 to 1, even 3 to 1. California has effectively become a one-party state, not because the liberals there were so persuasive in their arguments, but due to demographic changes. Now, I like to think that if I were a liberal, I would disdain to achieve victory by such a frankly underhanded method as simply overwhelming the votes of people who disagree with me with millions of voters from the third world. But even if you are a committed progressive and you'd like to see the rest of the country go the way of California, I have to ask you, what is the point of achieving permanent political power for the left-wing party if you then have a left-wing party that stands up for the interests of employers and not workers? Liberalism is supposed to be about taking care of the least among us. There's no one that unlimited immigration hurts more. It hurts the high school dropout or the ex-convict trying to get a foot on the ladder of employment. And if they do get a job, it keeps their wages low, makes it harder for them to find housing. Affirmative action was supposed to be about benefiting the descendants of slaves, and its greatest beneficiaries now are the sons and daughters of the third world's wealthiest families, sending their kids to elite American universities. As someone who's a Republican, I have some experience with belonging to a party that is sometimes too beholden to the interest of plutocrats. So let me tell the left something from the heart. It's possible to achieve power by selling out the interests of ordinary Americans in favor of people whose only priority is keeping wages lower and workers powerless. But it's a bargain with the devil, and it's certainly not very progressive.
All right, now we're going to have a round of rebuttals. First, let's go to the nation, and it's 4 minutes each. Sasha.
Thank you. Well, there are so many ways to get into this, it's hard to know where to start. But I think political corruption is as good a place as any. You've just heard that if we let immigrants into this country, we are seeding the groundwork for endemic political corruption. What planet are we on? Has nobody heard of Scott Pruitt? Has nobody heard of Donald Trump? Has no one heard of Zinke and all the other avatars of corruption who are doing perfectly fine without any votes from quote-unquote immigrants from third world countries? Corruption is a problem, but it isn't a problem triggered by the rise of mass immigration. And then we heard that immigrants were responsible for a whole bunch of terrible things like the New Deal, Social Security, unemployment assurance, 8-hour work week, awful things like that. And that they were also responsible for the Great Society, which brought us, I think, Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty. God forbid, if we let more immigrants in, we might actually get health care for everybody. We might actually get a sensible environmental policy, and really, really awful things like that. My other opponent mentioned that we can't have mass immigration because it impacts people at the bottom of the economy. Well, it is certainly true that in the post-World War II years, during the period of strict immigration quotas, there was indeed lower inequality, and people at the bottom of the economy did fairly well. But correlation does not equal causation. The reason inequality shrank in those years was because we had the most progressive tax system that we have ever had. It's the fact that we had things like Social Security. It's the fact that we used federal tax dollars to invest in affordable housing and the GI Bill and Medicaid and Medicare and higher education institutions. And it's the fact that during those years, trade unions had more power than they have had since and than they had had before. If you want to look for reasons for the lack of inequality in those decades, those are the reasons. Correlation does not equal causation. The fact that there were immigration quotas is no more responsible for the falling inequality than the fact that during those same decades there were atmospheric nuclear tests releasing radiation into the atmosphere. It's a red herring. I think what we've really heard tonight is the argument that the culture is undermined by quote-unquote third world immigrants, by people from other countries with different ways of looking at the world. Frankly, that is the same argument made by neo-fascist political movements in Europe, and it stinks in Europe, and it stinks here. And I should say it is no coincidence that one of my opponents told the Sydney Morning Herald last year that one of her favorite political figures on the global stage was Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally in France. This is ethno-nationalist politics of the worst variety. We are a generous country. We are a country that has historically welcomed in immigrants. We're a country that until recently welcomed in refugees. We're a country that until recently abided by international law in welcoming in asylum seekers. Our national emblem is the Statue of Liberty, which has those famous words carved on the base about welcoming the poor and the vulnerable and the displaced. That is who America is. That is what America is. And if we turn our backs on this, if we say we no longer have room to be generous, we are turning our backs on everything decent and moral in this country and its history. Thank you.
American conservative rebuttal time.
You know, I was always taught that it was not polite to argue religion in public. And I think when you're talking about these questions in such moral absolutes, are we welcoming or not? Is it just or not for societies to have borders? Is it just or not for countries to have a sense of national sovereignty? We're really not talking about a practical public policy. At that point, we are getting into things that are theological. And I don't dispute anybody's right to have whatever theological commitments they have. I think some might find some of my own theological commitments strange. But in the era of globalization, we are dealing with the inevitability of, through technology and economic change, of people from a variety of countries coming together, but also the reality that differences in values and differences in how people want to live and differences in ideology and differences that have led to war and conflict and ugly political climates throughout human history, those things still persist. So I think most human societies have been trying to find prudentially ways to balance the inevitability of a more globalized world with how do you then tackle with the fact that some people find it difficult to live with one another, and the fact that immigration in the United States has tended to come in flows of waves of large numbers of immigrants, then often followed by pauses where there are lower numbers of immigrants, during which time we've seen greater integration of previous immigrant communities into American society. And I think that's what we're calling for, to see something a little bit more along the lines of that happen today. You know, I don't think it's purely a coincidence that many of the advances of the welfare state that my opponents have mentioned did occur during a period of relatively low immigration, and that since we've had higher levels of immigration, these issues have become more contentious. I don't think that bringing in people to pay for the retirements of MAGA hat-wearing white old people is going to be a less contentious society. And I think that many members of the immigrant community who will be paying for said retirement may become somewhat resentful of that fiscal reality as well. I think what we need is an assimilationist policy. I think it is a fact that the bosses who are not fans of labor unions largely agree with the policy of mass immigration, of bringing in more immigrants who are not competing with them for their jobs for the most part, but competing with people from at the lower level of the income stream and of the class stream. Labor unions did not seek benefits for their workers by having the most open labor markets you could possibly have and by having a global race to the bottom in wage rates. That simply historically is not the case. And I think for both those who would like to see us have a more robust welfare state and those of us who would like to see us move back to something closer to the constitutionally limited federal government, the current patterns and numbers of immigration are overwhelming both political goals and making and are one easily controllable thing that are making these debates much uglier and less pleasant than they need to be. I think we all need to come together as Americans, regardless of where we came from, what we look like, what our accents are. But there are times, just as in food consumption, you need a diet, there are times where lower levels of immigration actually further the goals of assimilation and integration rather than undermine it. Thank you.
Michelle Chan.
So it sounded like my opponents were sort of arguing against themselves right there. Okay, first of all, arguing that a policy of immigration restriction is a good thing universally because it will keep Democrats out seems to be a fairly weak sauce argument, not only because a few years ago Republicans were championing Hispanics as natural Republicans, that was before Trump, of course, but also because they also argue against, say, inviting in more Muslims because they have these horrific hyper-conservative religious views, right? They want to turn everything into Sharia law. So these arguments against immigration are quite malleable, quite nebulous, and quite driven by emotion and perception, right? Which is interesting because that is often what they accuse us, sappy liberals of falling prey to. So just to go back towards the side of reason for a minute, I mean, arguing for more immigration restriction because having more immigrants come as they inevitably will is going to make racist people racist more. It also doesn't make sense to me. If the problem is that there are racist reactions to immigration, the problem is racism, right? It's not the immigrants. So you might think that the opposite of that, for arguing for more liberal border policy or for more liberal immigration laws, would be inviting in anarchy, inviting in chaos. I mean, listen to the language and the rhetoric that conservatives often put forward when they're talking about immigration, which is typically like, they talk about flows of people, hordes of people coming over the border, right? As if it's this sort of like unctuous human mass that's just sort of, festering at our borders, like it's, an invasion of parasitical human beings. It's, thronging to be let in. And I would say that this is not inviting in chaos. It's sort of letting a fairly osmotic flow of people from a place that my opponents might call the third world. I would call it perhaps the developing world, the global south, but people who are coming from places with less resources simply wanting to better their own circumstances, right? We might call them economic migrants, we might call them economic refugees. In many cases, they're actively fleeing state persecution or unlivable conditions in their home countries, right? But either way, they have a justifiable claim to want a better life for themselves, right? And I don't believe that an arbitrarily drawn national boundary should get in the way of that. Think about it this way. A basic precept of humanity is that when it comes to the duty of the state, it's the government's responsibility to govern fairly and ensure the welfare of these people, right? The people in its jurisdiction, right? They're the people within our borders, and they're perhaps the people at our borders, right? Legitimately seeking asylum under the Geneva Conventions. That is international law. But in any case, it is not up to us to only care about our own citizens, right? We have a variety of tiers of legitimacy of different people. I wish it weren't that way, but we have people who are green card holders, people who are have temporary protected status, people who are DACA holders, right? So we have all sorts of different ways of credentialing legitimacy in this country, which are all sort of fundamentally unjust in the sense that they sort of tier humanity, right? I would argue that we should move at least towards a system in which there's more equal access to legal resources, to the benefits of the Bill of Rights, right, to the equal protection of laws, because that is fundamental to our constitutional values, right? I mean, it is basically about who we are, not who the immigrants are. So people argue that they should come the right way, that they should apply to work legally in the US. But the fact is, we have legal immigration in this country, and we still treat them poorly. But that is a product of our failed policies. It is a product of our failed labor law. And it is a product of policies that fail every American, not just immigrants.
Thank you. Helen Andrews.
Well, both of our opponents told us that they're concerned about inequality. I'm glad I am too. That's why I wouldn't like to see the rest of America go the way of California, one of the most unequal states in the union right now. A good rule of thumb on estimating the effects of immigration is always convergence, that the immigrants will become a little bit more like us and will become a little bit more like the countries that they came from. Well, one aspect of Latin America that California is converging towards is massive inequality. There is no country in Latin America where the middle class makes up a majority. Their distribution is and has always been a lot more lopsided. You have a tiny elite, about 15% of the population, and a massive toiling underclass, and an itty-bitty middle class sandwiched between them. That's the social structure of Honduras, and these days it's the social structure of San Francisco. But I don't think the oligarchs of San Francisco have quite thought through the social consequences of embracing Brazil-style inequality. Because what always happens is that as the toiling underclass gets further immiserated and conditions deteriorate, and your one-party government becomes more and more inefficient, you gradually reach the point where the government can no longer provide basic public services like keeping the streets free of needles and human feces, which if you've been to San Francisco, you know is not a metaphor. And what happens when you reach that point is that the oligarchs withdraw behind walls. They pay for their own privatized versions of government services. They pay for their own private security, like you find in Sao Paulo. And they pay for their own private bus lines to substitute. But the people who get sandwiched are the formerly middle class, anybody who can't afford those own privatized versions of government services. And they suddenly wake up to discover that their middle class standard of living is no longer available to them, which is why the middle class is fleeing California in droves. But if the rest of the country goes the way of California and starts converging on that style of inequality, the rest of us won't have anywhere to flee to. Now, both of our opponents repeated the old canard that restrictionists are motivated by xenophobia and hate. I think if you want to look for hate, you need to look at the other side of this debate. I hear so often from the left about the coalition of the ascendant and the emerging Democratic majority. And we don't need to court the votes of the white working class, because soon enough, due to demographic changes, their votes won't matter anyway, which carries the unspoken, or surprisingly often spoken, implication that all the white working class needs to do is hurry up and die. Well, you know what? They are dying. They're the reason why, as we just learned this morning, life expectancy in America has declined another year in a row. Life expectancy in a first world country isn't supposed to decline at all, much less a drop of the levels that we last saw in World War I and the era of the Spanish influenza. And they're dying of things like opioid overdoses, or suicide, or cirrhosis of the liver. So yeah, you're telling them to hurry up and die, and they're getting right on that. But I don't think that's a thing to celebrate or to gloat about.
Thank you. All right, now we have time I'm going to ask a couple of questions of each side, and then we're going to open it up to you in the audience. We have a microphone stand, I can't see very well, where you can line up if you have a question, and I'll try to get to you. We've got about 24 minutes for this phase of the debate. So I picked up obviously several themes that we've heard. I want to come to the nation side and ask, I want to come back to the question of inequality. The basic question they've raised, seems to me from several different points, is if you let in so many people who need assistance, which so many immigrants do, not all, but many do, what does that do to the economic fabric of this country? Can the United States afford to continue to take people who need government assistance?
It's a great question, and they did talk very much about inequality, and the last speaker said that we didn't care about the white working class and that we were telling the white working class to hurry up and die, neither of which we said. We care very much about the white working class and every other segment of this society. Here's the thing. Poor people coming into America to work has been the dynamic driving force economically in this country for centuries. We need workers to come in to keep the economy vibrant. If you're concerned about inequality, you'd do far better off protecting trade union rights. You'd be far better off creating universal health care, since health care is the single biggest trigger into bankruptcy in this country. If you cared about inequality, you would support an anti-corporate agenda. But everything about what we've heard ignores the fundamental reasons for cascading inequality in this country and seeks to do a bait and switch and to blame impoverished immigrants for that inequality. And it's just not the case. It's trying to get the poorest of the poor divided and fighting over crumbs. And this country has always thrived at its best when we welcome in people regardless of color, we welcome in people regardless of religion, we welcome in people regardless of their economic status, and we say that if you come into this country, you make it better. When we have that optimism, the economy flourishes.
I'm just going to turn that around to Jim and Helen. What about that?
Well, my view is that there is nothing that is a more pro-corporate position than arguing for unlimited immigration or virtually unlimited immigration of the lowest wage workers. And it is a fact that labor unions work by restricting labor, not by having the most free-flowing labor market that you can possibly have. I think some immigration restrictionists are, in fact, too Malthusian in how they talk about immigration, and they do talk about it as more of a zero-sum game than it is. But it is a fact that supply and demand does exist, and it applies to your labor market as well as anything else. And people at the lower end of the income scale are more responsive to those flows of supply and demand and increase in labor supply than are people who are in the middle and upper economic tiers.
Let's just keep going with this question. Do you want to comment?
Right, so just to put a couple numbers out there, even by the narrowest measure, undocumented immigrants, that is the immigrants who are here who do not have proper work authorization, the folks you say are not paying their fair share, right? By any measure, they contribute far more simply in terms of taxation than they do than they take in terms of the welfare state, right? So this argument that immigration invites inequality is a very curious one, given that they tend to be net contributors to society, right? And there's an actual estimate out there that says there would be at least $12 billion, right, that is missing from the economy were it not for undocumented laborers who are actually economic agents and they do pay taxes, contrary to popular belief. We would gain an extra $3 billion in our GDP if we simply gave them legal status, right? So that is a sheer economic argument. Moreover, let's look at the costs of immigration enforcement, and we have, of our current hyper-enforcement regime. So in fiscal year 2018, we spent more than $3 billion in Homeland Security money on custody operations, right? So that's $8.43 million per day on immigration detention alone. This is the incarceration of people who, if they were simply allowed to go free home to their communities and care for their families, they could be parents to their children, right? They could be helping their children in school, and they could be working, tax-paying members of society and of the economy, right? But instead, we incarcerate them for no other reason than they have committed a civil, not a criminal, right, immigration violation, right? So if you're worried that immigrants are undercutting the conditions of US workers, The idea is not to limit the number of workers we have, right? Otherwise, we could argue also against equal employment for women, for that matter. But the solution is to treat them equally to American workers. We need equal enforcement of labor laws, right, across immigrants, not just creating a two-tier workforce, which is what we have now. So I would say that even conservative economists should be arguing that more immigration is ultimately a good thing. But beyond that, this is simply a question of social justice. It shouldn't matter what these people bring in net to our economy, though that is certainly a benefit of immigration if you're going to think in those terms. But what I would argue is that we have a fundamental humanitarian and human obligation to care for people who have a legitimate claim to want to enter our country.
And I want to ask Helen to respond to that, and then I do want to get some audience questions in.
Sure, well, I'll be brief. Let's talk numbers. That is music to my ears, Michelle. I know there's a lot of academic debate and scholarly debate about the effect of massive immigration on U.S. wages, but the scholar I trust the most on this is George Borjas up at Harvard, and his most recent finding was that just between 1980 and 2000, immigration increased the size of the U.S. workforce by about 11%, and that had the consequence of lowering wages for natives by 3%, a little over 3%. And for people without a high school education, it was more like 9%. That's a serious chunk of change. So I don't see why American workers should be asked to, out of some sense of solidarity, welcome an infinite supply of cheap labor that only has the effect of diminishing their own take-home pay.
All right, let's take some questions from you. Just step up to the microphone.
Thank you so much for having this.
And if you could make your question brief, because we've got only 17 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for having this very central debate to our civilization. But basically, here's the situation. The narrative is partly flawed historically in favor of immigration due to the political correctness from the media, from intellectuals, from politicians, and the education system in front of ugly realities. Despite all the subterfuges, we know that Democrats want immigration to boost their voting power. And also on the Republican side, unfortunately, the rhinos or whatever of what they call the Chamber of Commerce, of course, wants to put pressure downward on wages by bringing immigration as well. And that is creating a big problem.
Could you get to your question, please, so they can...
Well, my question is, I'm French, okay? I grew up in France. And right now, as we speak, basically this globalization process is falling flat in its face as Macron is basically self-destructing beautifully. Now, I want you to comment on that, because what you're watching in Europe is coming here already. Thank goodness that the United States and British were ahead of the curve and voted for Brexit and Trump. Okay, I'm sorry. This is what's going on. I could go on explaining for 2 minutes what has not been said here. Because when the debate is flawed in favor of immigration, basically the whole discourse is meaningless. And I'm sorry, the policies that result from flawed politics will be destructive to our nation. I moved here from France 38 years ago. I'm wearing my yellow vest, okay? And you're asking me to ask a question when I'm trying to explain in 2 minutes what I can really clarify very nicely. I mean, look.
Thank you very much.
Not all cultures are the same.
We disagree on a lot, but I bet the four of us agree it's time for you to stop, sir.
We have other people.
You don't like the truth. You have to suppress it. You have to basically...
You're wasting our time.
Oh. Right, so he just said the discussion was pointless,
could we
so we can all go home now.
If we could just have a brief question and direct it to one side or another.
Thanks for the event. Thanks for both debate teams. And I think I'm in favor of, although I don't mean that need immigrants, but I think welcome immigrants instead. And so I'm sort of in favor of the nation. But I would like you mostly to consider the conservative part. I think you are usually underestimate the productivity of immigrants. And you put all the social problem to immigrants. That is false. Because I can tell you, I can contest you, there is a super class of crime is committed by our Native American, white Americans. And of course, they can utilize all kind of races to be their slaves to produce more crime. So I would like you to put the real productivity of immigrants, and they do really raise fantastic children. They all raised a lot of good school credit. The school produced a competition, the school competition, and science competition. So they are really make American friends and make the American society better. And so you don't try to say immigrants to destroy the American society. It's the other way around. And besides, immigrants take all kind of job, low job, and put as a babysitter, as any domestic worker. That's appreciate their contribution.
Thank you very much. If I could summarize your question, I mean, her point is that more crime is being committed by native-born Americans, that we are unfairly tarring and targeting immigrants. I believe that was...
Well, you asked us to appreciate the contribution of immigrants, and I absolutely think we should. I love the contribution of immigrants. And frankly, if there's one aspect of President Trump's rhetoric on immigration that I'd like to see him drop, it is about crime. Because I think you're right, that immigrants have lower rates of crime and even violent crime than natives. So I think that's a fair point. Well taken.
All right. Yes, sir. Question.
Well, tonight we've heard some very helpful and sometimes passionate views expressed. I think there's one dimension that we've not heard discussed tonight, and that is what is our population policy in this country. We know that we are living in a finite world. We have had a population commission that gave a report to us 20 years ago, which we've not considered, and that has impact, should have impact on what our immigration policy is.
What do you mean by population policy?
Population policy is recognizing we have finite resources in this country to support our population. As scientists, we know that we are already overpopulated.
So you mean limits on immigration? Is that what you're saying?
Well, limits on population, not on immigration. Okay. But we also recognize that.
So do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is I'd like to hear from both sides on how a finite amount of natural resources informs our population policy and how that affects our immigration policy.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it seems to me there are two issues. The first is resources. And again, this whole notion that our resource problem would be solved if we clamp down on immigration makes no sense, because the vast amount of resources are used by the people with the most money. They're the people who buy the biggest cars, they're the people who buy the biggest houses, they're the people who use the most water in their swimming pools and so on. You don't solve a resource crisis by blaming an impoverished immigrant coming from, let's say, Honduras. The second part of your question, population. All of the research globally shows that the best way to control population is education. When you educate people, especially when you educate women, you see controls in population. So again, the idea that because we have finite resources and we have a growing population, that we therefore have to banish immigrants outside of our borders, that doesn't solve any problems. If you want to deal with resources and if you want to deal with population, overwhelmingly, the best response is global systemic education policy.
I think. Oh.
Okay. Should American citizens take more responsibility in terms of sponsoring refugees and asylum seekers or different issues? Canada allows refugees to be sponsored by non-relatives. Should the United States do that? And would that help settle the issue with the caravans, where we don't really know how big our security problems are? It seems like we don't know really what's going on.
American Conservative, do you want to comment?
The problem with the caravan is not that we're not taking enough refugees, it's that the problems in Central America are not amenable to a refugee-style solution, right? Like the number of refugees from Southeast Asia that we took after the end of the Vietnam War was 300,000. The population of El Salvador alone is close to 7 million. 100% of whom are affected by the ongoing violence there. It's not a small minority that's being persecuted, it's everybody has a difficult situation. That's not the kind of problem that the asylum system can solve or was intended to solve. And the fact that they're trying to immigrate on the basis of asylum, which they don't qualify for given the conflict in their country, is an abuse of the asylum system, and not, I think, very honorable.
On our refugee policy, Canada actually has a very different system that is driven by private sponsorship. And if we want to turn over our entire refugee system, our entire refugee and asylum-seeking regime, to a question of private sponsorship. I think that's a larger question for what our social welfare state is intended to do, as well as for how our immigration regime works. Is it governed by laws, or is it governed by private preferences? I mean, this is a fundamental policy debate that would be, much larger, I think. So, I mean, that is an interesting question. And in some ways, you might argue that private sponsorship would create a more lenient system, but it's also a less regulated one in the sense that it is driven by private interests. So that, just putting that aside, I think the issue about who qualifies for asylum, though, is definitely an issue of public policy, right? And it is so in every single country that is under the Geneva Conventions. Our refugee law is built on a variety of case law, as well as the fundamental idea that you should not be returned to a place where you are going to face inevitable, threats of death and persecution. People from Central America are indeed fleeing mass violence, in many cases poverty, in many cases horrific abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it is criminal drug gangs, whether it is a failed state, right? But all these state institutions, frankly, are failing them. If you're going to talk about resource pressures, you should look over at the countries they're coming from, right? They all at least do have a right to due process, right? Whether or not you think they have a legitimate claim, I believe they do. The Trump administration is doing everything in its power to limit those claims simply in order to keep them out, but simply let them have their day in court. To defund our court system and to make people wait indefinitely at the border in cages, right, is not a just solution to anything.
All right, next question, please.
Yes. Well, I've been told that I came here to impoverish the American lumpen proletariat. I came here to get richer. And so did my family, and we've done very well both in this country and elsewhere. However, I would like to remind you particularly, that Democrats are not responsible for social improvements. You're following Disraeli and Bismarck on social policies and they implemented social policies to improve democracy, and that's what they're doing here. You talk about, quite clearly, your focus is on this 1 million people, which is 0.3% of the population, an aging population, and a population that is then being driven away by bad health care. But, the biggest terrorist in the world is the American government. It has been bombing and undermining Central America for how long? 40 years?
Sir, do you have a question?
Take your responsibility. You are bombing the Middle East for the last 40 years, and you're creating all these problems for Europe, like the refugees that you're bombing. Even now you're bombing the Houthis.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yes. Why don't you stop bombing the world and creating the refugee problem in the first place?
I would absolutely love to do that.
Yeah, have you read The American Conservative? You'll love it.
Right. My question is simply this, and it's to both sides of the aisle. With roughly 22 million Americans that are underemployed, about 4.8% of our population that is unemployed, and according to U6, a very large number of people that have simply given up looking for work. They're discouraged. What recommendation, if immigration is the panacea for lifting someone from this kind of suffering, where would you recommend these millions of Americans immigrate to?
Immigrate to?
To.
You mean?
I'm curious, just.
Norway? I don't know.
Yeah, they have a great healthcare system. No, right. I'm not advocating for more emigration from the United States, though I think people certainly
But you're saying immigration is this cure, this panacea.
No.
So it's not a cure. It's not a panacea for these. I was in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago. I lived there for 20 years. The size of Skid Row has doubled. And I used to live in downtown Los Angeles. There are homeless encampments all going into all the underpasses. I'm just saying, where should these discouraged, displaced, thrown overboard Americans immigrate to if immigration is the cure?
Well, no one, I don't think anyone, whether on this side or the other side, has said immigration is a global panacea for problems. It isn't a global panacea. It's part of our globalized reality. There always has been, in the interconnected global world, there have always been population flows. People go from one country to another country to another country, and partly they go because they're being persecuted, and partly they go looking for economic opportunity. But it's not for me to say, all right, impoverished Americans, and you're right, there are millions of impoverished Americans. I've written books on it, I've written articles on it, I'm well aware of the scale of American poverty. But it's not for me to say to those impoverished immigrants, you need to immigrate somewhere else. If they want to immigrate, and if they want to seek their fortune or their well-being or their security somewhere else, I believe it's their right to do so. But it's not for me to order them to do that and to leave this country.
I think at the heart of your question, though, is also a question
of... If immigration is the panacea.
But we didn't say it was.
No one here is arguing that it's a panacea, right? So that is a straw man argument that is ultimately going to be met with disappointment because none of us made it.
Answer his question.
Right.
Where should we? I mean,
so,
what country will allow you in without any kind of regulation, without any kind of limitation? Show me a country on the planet that will do that and think it's in their best interest. I'm sorry, but
the issue here is that a more liberal immigration policy is not a zero-sum game. It does not come at the expense of native-born Americans, right? If we have policies that fail native-born Americans, and by the way, many of those unemployed people, many of those impoverished people are immigrants themselves, right? So let's get that out of the way.
I suggest you go through Skid Row in Los Angeles.
Okay, I've been through Skid Row in Los Angeles many, many times, and I've interviewed people on Skid Row, and I've interviewed homeless people, and I've interviewed people on food banks. And I'm well aware there's an extraordinary problem with poverty. We're not saying it's a panacea to immigrate, nor are we arguing for absolutely open borders. Neither of us over the last hour and a half of debate has said anything about completely open borders. The debate topic is whether immigration is good and whether more or less immigration is good. And we've argued more immigration is good. Now, does that mean we should tell
okay, sir, I think we need to give other people
a
chance to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, next.
Buenas noches. Hello. Two quick questions. One is, can you please describe the effects of former Governor Pete Wilson's policies and what that had in terms of California politics? And also, what is the role of U.S. intervention in Central America, particularly in Honduras, and how that generates immigration? Muchas gracias.
All right, who wants to quickly tackle that? We're now down to 1 minute and 50 seconds left. Pete Wilson's
Well, I mean, there's a big debate over whether Pete Wilson, by supporting Proposition 187, which banned taxpayer monies from going to undocumented immigrants, whether that is responsible for the leftward shift of California politically. I would argue that that ignores the fact that Democrats took both Senate seats 2 years before that happened in 1992 when Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein were elected, that you saw George H.W. Bush lose California by an overwhelming margin after Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan each carried it twice, 2 years before Proposition 187. The post-1986 amnesty cohort did play its own role in the leftward movement of California. Now, if you have increasing immigrant populations and political parties perceived as being nasty to them, that's not going to be good for that political party's electoral fortunes either. But I think that it is unmistakably the case that the political shift in California happened before Pete Wilson switched on immigration and before Proposition 187 passed.
All right. We have time for another question.
Okay.
Like they just gave us a little more time.
I promise I will not make a speech. I'll just want to ask a quick question, and I'd like a response from each side on a proposal that I would have, which would be to end the so-called diversity lottery and to take the 50,000 slots that are associated with that and apply it to increasing the number of refugees that we accept in the United States.
Go on.
We've halved the ceiling on refugee admissions, more than halved it. We've reduced it by about 3/4 since Trump took office, right? There's no way that the 50,000 will make up for what we have lost. Besides which, we're not even we're not even taking up that number of refugees. So we're falling far short of even that ceiling. The problem with refugee policy is that it is fundamentally unjustly enforced, right? It is, the screening is almost impossible to get through, and it asks impossible tasks of people in terms of producing paperwork that is necessary to get through this awful bureaucracy, right? It is a violation of their human rights, and it is in no way in compliance with the Geneva Conventions, right, if you're going to go that route. The diversity lottery is a bit of a diversion, I think, because Trump was fixated on it. It is actually an incredibly small part of our immigration system. But I do think that things like the diversity lottery should be abolished because they're just these arbitrary little categories that we carve out of our immigration system that are really have no basis in either rational policy making or human need, right? I think we should have a much more equitable distribution of immigrant slots, if you will, if we must go that route, across the board. And it shouldn't be reduced to a bean counting exercise, nor should it be a strictly meritocratic exercise, as Trump claims to want, because, going back to my teammate's argument, frankly, we're not going to get all Norwegians, no matter how hard we try.
And the conservatives on that proposal?
4 million people, 4 million refugees from Syria, global refugee population counting in the tens of millions, another 50,000 that we took when we already take 3/4 of the total people resettled. It might help, but it's a drop in the bucket. So.
I would like to move to a more meritocratic system, something a little bit more like Canada's point system, rather than have things like the diversity visa lottery. I do think the question of refugees, while it is a subset of the immigration debate, is a somewhat different question than who we're admitting to become permanent members of American society. Refugee status obviously is for people in particular cases of hardship. I'm not inalterably opposed to increasing those number of slots while reducing immigration in other categories.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question.
Hi. We're hearing, I think, two very different debates going on. I'm sure everyone's figured that out. But I think on this side, we're hearing a question of how many we should let in, and more of an open borders leaning policy. I know you said you don't support that, but leaning more that way. On this side, we're hearing a conversation about who we should let in, and that's really the fundamental question, because you've already set your number at the number that we currently let in every year. However, we can't just maintain those forever. So what I want to know is at what point do you draw the line? So for you, you said you don't maintain a completely open borders policy. What is your line on that? And for you, if you're willing to draw the lines on the basis of who we let in, I know you mentioned a meritocratic system a little bit more, but on what basis would we determine who those people are?
All right, let's start with, thank you. Let's start with the question over here. Where do you draw the line?
No, it's a great question. And anybody who's being honest about this issue has to wrestle with the fact that at some point there is a line. And I know that there's debate on the left, and there may be debate at this table, and there's probably debate in this broader room about where that line should be drawn. I don't have a problem with a country setting a border policy, and I don't have a problem with some reasonable enforcement on that border. I do have a vast problem with militarizing borders, and I have a vast problem with tear gassing asylum seekers, including children. But do I have a problem with the principle of having some border policy in place? No. Now, that said, the reason we have so many undocumented immigrants coming in is not because people choose to be undocumented, it's because we have a vast problem of desperation to our south, and we have a failed immigration policy that people on the left and on the right agree needs to be fixed, but we can't work out how to fix it. So the default is it pushes people into the shadows. Here's my problem with saying everything is about enforcement. If you say everything's about enforcement, you don't stop immigration, because as long as there are people who are hungry and as long as there are people who are desperate, you're going to have immigration. If you militarize the enforcement, all you do is you push people out into ever more dangerous forms of crossing. So they die of overheating in the desert, or they get caught in people smuggling operations, or they end up as sexual prey, and you turn an awful lot of people who are already vulnerable into even more vulnerable human beings. That's the problem I have with militarizing the border. But do I have a problem with enforcing the border? No. And do I have a problem with setting numbers? No, I've never said we should have tens of millions of people coming into this country each year. That wasn't the debate. The debate was just more or less, and we said we should have more.
All right, thank you. Now let's turn to the question for the American conservative. You talked about who we should let in, and her question is, let's define that a little bit, about who. I mean, you talked about meritocratic. What would you
Well, first of all, I would say that how many is very important, and that's why I don't favor increases. I don't think that we really would arrive at I don't think our government is competent to make these merit-based decisions if the numbers are too large. I also think that any immigrant group with the right amount of time and numbers can assimilate and be successful in the United States, but I do think numbers of people matter. Having said that, yes, I'd like to have a point system where, well, number one, at a broader level, before we even get to the point system, I'd like to see some of our composition of immigration shift a little less from the family reunification side and a little bit more employment-based immigration. So on the employment-based side, I would like to see points awarded to people on the basis of certain technical skills, things that are needed for jobs in the United States, English proficiency, likelihood to become a public charge at some point, that those things would be evaluated before we admit people, and we would admit a larger number of people within our overall group of immigrants that we admit each year who are coming here to not just do the lowest wage jobs and are coming here not just because they are related to a legal permanent resident who's already here.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Okay, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions. We've now spent even more time than we had planned, but we thank each one of you for coming forward and asking your questions. I will make one personal observation. It seems to me the two sides have come closer together than we realized maybe at the beginning of the evening. But now is the time for closing statements. We have 16 minutes. That's 4 minutes per person, 8 minutes on each side. And we're going to start with the American conservative. Okay. These are closing statements.
Okay. So there are a lot of problems in America right now more pressing than immigration. There's the opioid crisis, which at this point is killing more Americans per year than died in the entire Vietnam War. There's the retreat of men from the workforce, to the point where now 14 million men, 12% of the prime age working force, are not even looking for a job. There's the collapse of marriage, where we're now in the unprecedented situation where 58% of millennials now reach the age of 36, never having been married. The first generation where a majority hit middle age without ever having tied the knot. And the collapse of marriage means the collapse of birth rates with all of the other problems that go along with declining fertility. All of those problems are more important than immigration. But what they all have in common is that they would all get better if we had an immigration pause. If we didn't have a constant supply of cheap labor coming in from south of the border, maybe those employers would have to hire some of those marginal men who are out of the workforce now, and put some money and effort and training into making them good employees again. And if those men had jobs, maybe they wouldn't be so prey to the addiction that's killing so many Americans. The reason why so many millennials are putting off marriage is because they want to wait until they can settle down. And settling down means having a good, steady, well-paying job, which unlimited immigration makes harder. And it means finding a house. Immigration pushes up housing costs, which is why California has some of the highest housing prices in the nation. 30% of Californians spend more than half of their income on housing, which is one reason why the United States has the lowest birth rate it's had in 30 years, but California has the lowest birth rate it's had in 100 years. The birth rate in California is lower than it was during the Great Depression. When Arizona passed SB 1070 and its population of illegal immigrants went down by 40%, rental vacancies went up and rents went down. Housing in Phoenix is now affordable for a young family just starting out. Just think what would happen to the marriage rate or to the birth rate if something like that happened in the rest of the country. We've heard from the other side tonight that Trump and Trump voters are motivated by fear, but I think they're motivated by hope. American voters have been ignored and lied to on the issue of immigration for more than 50 years. It was always the case that no matter who they voted for, nothing was going to happen because neither side, neither party was going to do anything to antagonize the special interests that benefit from low wages. And Trump is the first politician in this century that has finally listened to what the people keep saying they want, lower levels of immigration. And it's already working, even just in the last year. Wages are up, but they're up most for people who lack a high school education. Unemployment among people without a high school degree is down 40% from its historical average. And so I think that finally, after 50 years of being lied to and betrayed by their politicians, with Trump, they finally have a sense of hope and that something might get accomplished. And that some of the benefits from closing the borders might finally be coming to them. And I think that that's a hope that we should all do our best to satisfy.
So it seems that most of those arguments were about things other than immigration, but the fundamental argument was that even though these things are not caused by immigration, somehow having less immigration will improve all of those problems. I'm not sure how you can logically make that argument, but I would argue that all of these problems, they might actually involve immigrants, but they don't actually involve the issue of guarding our borders, policing our borders, limiting the number of people who come here, et cetera, right? It's true that just as racism amplifies inequality problems in this country, just as unemployment amplifies the failures of our welfare state, every single social crisis is a signal of some other social crisis. But I would argue that immigration is probably the least of these problems, and if anything, we have a net benefit to gain from immigration. But ultimately, I just want to say that perhaps where I differ a little bit from my teammate is that I'm not antithetical to this idea of open borders. I do not believe that we should throw open the borders tomorrow, right? I do argue that under our current system, we need a better system, a much more fair system of enforcement if we are going to have enforcement at all. But the idea of open borders to me is not an invitation to chaos. Rather, people who advocate for open borders from the left, they believe that, they're also in favor of mitigating the crises that produce migration into our borders, right? They're also in favor of creating a more humane and just society across the world, right? And that is the one thing, if you're going to talk about limiting immigration, that is going to limit the drive for these people to want to mobilize, right? Freedom of movement is often driven by human need, right? If you reduce the horrific levels of global inequality in this country, across the world, right, not just within this country, then you would inevitably reduce not only the drive to migrate, but also the levels of inequality within this country, right? But none of those things have to do with who we let in, right? None of those things have to do with how many we let in, fundamentally. Because all of those things have to do with what we are in terms of a nation of laws, in terms of how we set our social policy, right? And in terms of how we not only welcome newcomers among us, but also care for the people within our borders, right? Regardless of their citizenship, what color they are, or who they were born to, or what side of the border they were born on, right? And I would just argue by saying that migrants, they're workers, right? They're students, they're our family, they're our partners, and they are people who care for us in our old age, right? We simply cannot live without them. And in that sense, we do need more, right? And we will inevitably have more, no matter how hard you try to shut the border, right? I argue for genuine social equity, and that means we need more immigration because it makes our society more humane, right? And we have a moral duty to accept people fleeing injustice. So not just in the narrow sense of the Geneva Convention definitions of refugee and asylum, but also in terms of a higher level of social justice to which we should aspire as the wealthiest nation in the world, right? Anti-immigrant sentiment is driven by many things. It's driven by fear, racism, desperation, but most of all, ignorance. And the way to fix ignorance is not to dig down deeper into it and shut people away from us. It is to seek enlightenment and confront the problems that immigration perhaps signifies, right? But have nothing to do with immigrants themselves, right? So I believe in a humane immigration policy that whenever possible honors free movement, because I believe that any just law must honor humanity first and foremost. And because to move is to be human, when you reject migration, you reject your own humanity as well as theirs.
American Conservative.
There are many people on the other side of this debate who I think have very good intentions. There are some people on my side of the debate who have bad intentions. But I think some well-intentioned people have allowed themselves to support an immigration policy that is, at this point, doing more to import a servant class for a white, affluent group of people at the expense of an American working class that is itself disproportionately black and Latino, and where the strongest economic research is on the question of what it does to the wages of recent immigrants themselves. I categorically reject the idea that opposing this policy or even raising skeptical questions about it is somehow inherently racist. It is not. There was a time during this debate where there were many more people on the left who were on our side in this debate. There were labor unions, there were environmental groups, there were civil rights leaders. There was a time when there was the recognition that having an immigration policy that serves the interests of the bosses and not the workers was a compassionate and humane thing to do. No one is talking about no migration or calling migration illegitimate, but immigration has a lot of reaches into a number of other areas of public policy in the United States at a time where jobs are disappearing, where low-skilled work is becoming more scarce, where we're talking about perhaps having self-driving cars that could lead to 10 million truck drivers not having any work in the near future. There are no obvious and easy answers to those problems. You can't legislate away technological advances. We face some very serious problems that don't have anything directly all the time to do with immigration, but the first thing we could do is have an immigration policy that does not worsen these problems. When you find yourself in a hole, you can stop digging. We can do things that will lower the immigration rate and shift the composition of the immigration that we're admitting each year, slightly less in the direction of family reunification, somewhat more in the direction of employment-based immigration, and you still will have a lot more migration into the United States than most countries in the world accept. What I reject, however, is a composition of our immigration that really just serves the interests of those who already have a great deal and who are privileged, and does not lead to greater unity in this country. I think we've seen in our past where we've brought groups of immigrants together, sometimes during periods after an immigrant wave, where we've had a bit of an immigrant pause. The civil rights movement, many accomplishments of American liberalism happened during a 40-year immigration pause. I think we can do something like that again, and it would best serve both the interests of those who want a more robust American welfare state and also those of us who would like to see a more limited government and stronger, more vibrant communities. I think this policy would be best for America. I think it would be best for the immigrants themselves. And that is really what immigration is about. It's not simply about who will take a job at the lowest possible wage. It is about who the next Americans will be, that we will all together be Americans. Thank you.
And the nation.
You've heard a lot tonight about how immigrants are responsible for everything from the opioid crisis to automation to political corruption to overreach of big government. What you haven't heard but is in the background is the demagoguery of the current conversation around immigration. A conversation which will have you believe that immigrants are invaders, infestors, that they are a pestilence, that they are terrorists, that they are criminals. It is a shameless and it is a violent demagoguery, and it is cheapening who we are as a community. This country has roughly 43 million immigrants. They are hardworking, they are community building, they are tax paying, and they are striving. You and I, we live amongst them, we work with them, our kids play with them, and go to school with them. Those immigrants are modern-day versions of my great-grandparents, who fled the Pale of Settlement in Russia, fled religious persecution and poverty, and some went to the United Kingdom, and some went to the US, and they reinvented themselves. They came, as did generations before them, as have generations after them. because they want economic opportunity and they want freedom from persecution. They long for better worlds for themselves. They long for better worlds for their children. They came because they heard America's siren call. Make no mistake, that siren call is every bit as beautiful as a work of art like Beethoven's Ode to Joy or Billie Holiday's God Bless the Child. Those immigrants pay more in taxes than they take in social services. One study after another shows that. They move into oftentimes struggling neighborhoods and they rejuvenate them. They invent things, they discover things, they start businesses. I'll give you some numbers because numbers are important. The American Migration Council has found that 250,000 doctors in the United States are immigrants. The Migration Policy Institute has found that 17% of the nearly 12 million healthcare workers in this country are immigrants. Brookings Institute has found that 8% of teachers in this country are immigrants. Forbes has found that 25% of businesses started in this country are started by immigrants. And in California, that state we have been told is floundering and flailing because of high immigration, 40% of business startups are started by immigrants. Make no mistake, throughout American history, immigration has been a rocket fuel to our success, to our cultural success, to our economic success, to our political success, to our moral imagination. Our status as a place where immigrants come to dream their dreams is every bit as important to our preeminence on the global stage as is the fact that the dollar is the global's reserve currency. So let me return to the question at hand. More immigrants or less? I would beg you tonight to vote in favor of more immigrants. Not because the winner gets $5,000 to give to charity of choice, that's peanuts, but because all around the country, when C-SPAN gets around to broadcasting it, at least 2 or 3 dozen people are going to be watching it, and it's going to help shape public opinion. What you vote tonight matters because it sends a message. Are we a country, the well of generosity of which has run dry? Or are we a country that still has room to dream and to welcome? To open our hearts and our minds to people who come here because they believe this country offers something better. I beg of you, don't shut the door on America's role on the global stage tonight. Vote in favor of the resolution that we are a better country when we welcome more immigrants. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the nation, to the American Conservative for a vigorous debate over the last hour and a half. And what we want to do now, and it's really important, and we just heard Sasha Abramsky refer to it, is we want you to vote because that is going to determine which side won. And here's what we're asking you to do. If you believe now, having heard this debate, that America needs more immigrants, or if you don't, we ask you to text your response to 2233. And if you believe America needs more immigrants, then we ask you to type in The Nation, THENATION. But if you don't believe the answer to the question is, does America need more immigrants? If you disagree, 2233, but type in AMCONMAG, American Conservative Magazine, but the shorthand for that is AMCONMAG. So that's what we're asking you to do right now, to text that, or you may go to a website. The website is pollev.com, that's POLLEV.com, / Podius Debate, PODIUS DEBATE. So you have a choice. You can vote either by texting or by going online. It's very important that you do this because otherwise we don't know who's the winner. That's the way we're going to decide. We're going to understand which side was swayed because we're going to compare these votes, these numbers, to what we saw earlier. So we are, where do we stand right now? I have folks here who are standing by to tell me when we have some sense of the response. Because when we do, let's see, okay. All right, so that is the before or the after. That's what I'm trying to understand. Real time right now. So this is the response right now. 33 to 67.
How do we make sure everyone's only voting once?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
So the answer is much more no. 2 to 1, yeah, at this point. But it looks like some votes are still coming in. This is the real-time number, and we want to compare it to what we had before. There's a lot of suspense.
Wait, this is
The clock is ticking.
This is the new.
The new one.
Oh.
I don't know what the old one was.
I think we're giving people a little bit more time. Well, they've gotten closer together. 65-35.
So suspenseful.
Now, this is the before response, I believe. So that was, if that was 65-35, let's see. Okay, so this is the before poll. It was 54 yes, 46 no. And this is the after.
Recount!
So it does appear to be a victory for the American conservative. Am I understanding this correctly? That's what I think. Yes, America needs more immigrants. I just want to check my numbers counters to make sure we're reading it correctly. Is that right? Where are you? You're behind the stage. Okay. I don't want to declare the winner until you tell me those were the final numbers.
Judy, could you ask Emil to give us a thumbs up if that's correct? How much shares there?
Who?
Emil.
Okay. Okay. Thumbs up or not, if that's correct. That American conservative wins. Is that correct?
I can't even see what's going on up there.
We're getting
Okay, we got it. All right. So the winner is the American conservative. And what the winning team gets to do is to identify the charity which will receive the $5,000 prize. So American conservative, Jim and Helen.
We're giving the money to the Red Cross.
All right, very well. It's a good cause.
I can't argue with that.
So we know who the winner is, but we want to congratulate all of our debaters. Michelle, we certainly want to congratulate Michelle and Sasha, as well as Jim and Helen, because they've given it their all. We've had a great debate. You've been a great audience. We had wonderful questions from all of you, and we appreciate that. So on behalf of Podius, on behalf of George Washington University, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
C-SPAN's Washington